Welcome to Corporate Competitor, presented by Forbes Books. This is the podcast where executives share how the lessons they learned playing sports shaped their leadership. With me for today's episode is Marta Norton, Chief Investment Strategist at Empower, the second largest retirement plan provider in the United States, serving more than 19 million individuals across 83,000 organizations. Before joining Empower, Marta spent 18 years at Morningstar. She drew from the discipline and resilience she developed as a high school soccer player and college track athlete to rise to Chief Investment Officer of the Americas. Now make sure to check out corporatecompetitorpodcast.com/notes for my favorite quotes and reflection questions to help you apply today's insights.
It has been super costly taking that role, the role I'm in today. They're demanding jobs, right? But I don't have any regret. And I feel really good about giving myself as much as I can to these different roles. And so I would rather have less regret and more exhaustion than less exhaustion and more regret. And so it was just this marker in my life that reminded me to go for the big things that I wanted.
Marta, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
You know, I in our prep to get time with you, one of the interviews I read that you did, you mentioned that a lot of people can work hard for short periods of time, but what really drives success is that ability to work hard without stopping.
Yeah.
Now, it's such a great line. Tom Brady basically said the same thing when he was inducted into the Patriots Hall of Fame, and I loved listening to the way you described it. Can you tell me about a time that persistence, that ability to just drive, was a difference maker in your life?
Yeah. I mean, it's good to hear the reinforcement from someone like Tom Brady, of course, because
you and Tom Brady. I mean, I kind of had the two of you. Yeah, basically same thing.
But I really think it's true. And I was reflecting on it the other day, just as I was thinking about different things, because there's a lot of kind of mockery and consternation around this idea of participation trophies. Like just by showing up, you should get a trophy, and how silly that is, and how it's the anti perspective around a meritocracy. But there is a kernel of truth in the idea of a participation trophy, because there is a lot of distance that you can cover just by taking tiny steps every day. And so I'm not endorsing a participation trophy, but I am endorsing the idea that consistency and persistence have value in and of themselves, even if it feels like you're not accomplishing a whole lot on any given particular moment. I think this is one of the things that I would point to that has helped drive good outcomes in my life. And I guess the easiest example is something like the CFA designation that I have. So Chartered Financial Analyst designation. It's essentially a certification program in finance that is incredibly grueling. It has very low pass rates. It's done over the course of time, so over essentially 3 years. And it is one of those designations that you would have that say, I've earned the right to understand markets and finance and investing and whatever you have. It's kind of like an MBA for finance. And it's an incredibly grueling program, and the statistics aren't great in terms of people who start the program and people who finish.
Never finish, right?
And I never thought of myself as uniquely smart or, somehow some sort of savant around finance. And so it was kind of a daunting thing to pick up these books when I was a few years out of college and begin this program. And I remember the act of sitting down that first time for level one, and you get these books that, stack yay high, half my height essentially. And you just don't feel like you're ever going to get from January to May when the exam was, when I was taking it, and then do it 3 times in a row. But ultimately, I did earn my CFA designation. I passed the exams each year. And a big part of it was that I would sit down, for a few hours every day. And then as I got closer to the exam for all day, and I would study for this material, and I would take practice exams. I would get 40%, 45%. I mean, it was terrible. But that act of taking those steps on a regular basis ultimately were what led me to passing the exams and having the designation. I think persistence is almost everything.
And you would credit the time you had playing sports for teaching you some of that. I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I know, you played varsity soccer for all 4 years at Wheaton
Yeah.
North High School, the Falcons,
Falcon.
Fighting
Yeah.
Falcons, baby. And I know you contributed to some of the best records in the program's history, but when you think about what drew that persistence from you, what showed you the power of showing up,
Yeah.
was there a defining moment from that high school soccer career that still
Gosh.
sticks with you today?
I mean, so much of it. I mean, to be fair, I loved soccer. I loved soccer. I still love soccer. I think it is one of the most fun games to play. I didn't always love the CFA, so there's a distinction. But the thing is with soccer, as with all sports, there's a high level of skill that you have to achieve. So, the footwork element of soccer is something that you're not born with that. You have to really, really work at it. And the practices can be grueling and it can be exhausting. And you spend a lot of time chasing a ball around a field, seeing no discernible effect. But I would say that kind of the skill-based elements of soccer, putting in the time. So I was kind of a maniac about soccer. I played for my high school team. I played club teams. I was the kind of person who, if there was, I had tons of friends who played soccer. If there was a game and people needed players, I would drive all over Chicago to just play with a bunch of people I didn't really know and go home. And I think that kind of regularity to the practice really made the games more fun, made the practices more fun. And so there was something to be said about just putting in the time and looking back, not the next day, but 3 months down the road, 6 months down the road, a year down the road, and seeing how effective all the work was. It's not something that, and I think that's the thing. It's kind of like watching grass grow. It doesn't happen overnight, but over time, there's a massive impact of consistency.
Well, and as you said, the other thing that really worked for you was that you weren't just doing it in this one little window of time. You were committed to it, right?
Yes.
You were thrown into it in every way.
Completely.
Yeah.
Completely.
But then you go on to Wheaton College, right? Just right down the road from your high school.
Yeah, that's right.
And while you continued your athletic journey, you chose not to pursue soccer. Here's this thing that drives you. Tell us about that decision and how making that decision impacts you today.
I mean, it was actually hugely impactful, and it was. I describe myself as a maniac about soccer. I mean, playing everywhere I could, all over the place, and it wasn't really about winning so much as just love of the game. But by my senior year, I was really, really burnt out, and I had a club coach. I played for a club here in Chicago. I think it's still around. It's called Windy City Pride, and I had this coach who was pretty legendary, just a very tough guy, who had a lot of passion for developing very, very good athletes, sending them off to college. And he came up to me at some point my senior year. He said, "You're not playing the way you used to play. You're not playing right. Your head's not in the game. You need to pull yourself together." And I mean, that's the way coaches were back then. And he was right. I wasn't playing the way I used to. And I had lost some of that spark and some of that love for the game. And I was playing self-conscious. I was playing like I had something to lose, which is never how I used to play. And I don't exactly know what happened other than saying that there was some measure of being burnt out. I was super intent on playing soccer in college. I was very anxious about that. It was weighing on me. And by the time I had decided upon Wheaton, I was committed to playing soccer for them, but I had really lost the heart of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that summer, I remember writing this list of pros and cons, and I knew that ultimately I should play. And yet I just didn't have the heart for it. And so I pulled out. I ended up playing just kind of pickup games all over college. I played and I had fun again, but then I did other sports. I ran track and things like that. But I never really forgot that moment where there was this big challenge. Wheaton has an incredible team, very good team. I knew I could, but I would have to really fight to earn a prominent space on that team. And I just didn't have the fight in me at that point. And so looking back on that, it's always this kind of lost opportunity for me to be part of something really special. And it may have been the right choice given where I was in my head at the time, but it kind of hung over me. And what's interesting is that I used to work at a company called Morningstar, and the chief investment officer position opened up, and I passed on it the first time, just not even thinking about it, and had a bunch of people come up to me and say, "Why are you not applying for this job?" It comes up again in 2020. I have 3 kids at home. I'm exhausted. Work is hard. And there's this job that's coming up. And because people had been talking to me about it, I knew that it was something that others thought that I could do. And as I looked at the role, I thought I probably could do it. But I knew it was going to take a lot of energy, and energy that I didn't really feel like I had. And I was on the fence for a long time. And bizarrely, what came to mind for me as I was contemplating this role was college soccer and how I'd passed on it and how I
And you
hadn't.
didn't want to do the same thing twice.
I didn't want to do the same thing twice. And you know what? It has been super costly taking that role, the role I'm in today. They're demanding jobs, right? And I don't have the me time. I'm not a relaxed person, but I don't have any regret. And I feel really good about giving myself as much as I can to these different roles. And so I would rather have less regret and more exhaustion than less exhaustion and more regret. And so it was just this marker in my life that reminded me to go for the big things that I wanted.
Well, and so I'd like to go back to the burnt out portion.
Yeah.
Where you're talking about being burnt out at something, because
Yeah.
I think that's a place where a lot of people are, right? And
Yeah.
in their profession as well, in their business. How do you, if you could go back now, if you could think about it, and if you're coaching someone who's working for you,
Yeah.
that's exactly what we're always trying to do in this podcast, is coach people who want to aspire to do some of the things that you're doing.
Yeah.
How do you combat it in business? What advice would you give to someone who's feeling what you might have been feeling as a senior in high school?
Well, I think when I look at that moment in time, I had played soccer and played all sports. I was a huge tomboy as a kid. I played it out of a desire of joy, love of the game, for no other reason, because I loved to do it. And I wasn't doing it to impress anybody. And I wasn't doing it to win, even though ultimately as a competitor, you want to win, you want good outcomes. But I was doing it because of the experience of it.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got to the burnt out stage, I was doing it because I knew it impressed other people, or because I wanted to get something out of it. And I think that really that orientation, that shift from focusing on kind of how other people perceive it or on the outcomes rather than on the act of doing it, I think that is what burnt me out. I lost my focus. And I think you can do a lot of hard things when you have the right focus and when you have the right mandate. But when your mandate or your focus switch, I think that's when you can become really vulnerable to burnt out, to being burnt out. I see that in work too. I mean, ultimately, of course, we want to be successful in our careers. We want other people to see us as successful. We want to get that next gig, the higher comp or whatever it is. But if that is really the motivation, it's a really shallow motivation, and it's not going to get you through.
It will not carry you through.
No.
Right.
No. So I really think having the right mentality is everything to long-term success.
Yeah. Wow. And so you would coach, if you were coaching someone who worked for you at Empower, who might be struggling with a little bit of that, is maybe to kind of reflect a little, maybe go to that. I love that list of pros and cons, and actually doing that kind of work in the backdrop. You would coach somebody to actually get solid on the idea. What is that that motivation that's driving you, and once you get your arms around it being the right motivation, you
That's
think
right.
you can then power through things you might not otherwise be able to do.
There was a good book I read a few years ago called Tribal Leadership.
Yep.
And it was about companies having the right culture. And it talks about the different, levels of culture. And the top culture is a company that's not focused on competitors, not focused on how great the company is, but focused on doing something massive. And you think about, some of these great companies that we have, and some of their you're going to help me articulate them, but some of the mandates that they have, connecting the world, that was, Facebook's mandate, for what, do good or whatever it is. Was that Google or something like that? The mandates are not about beating earnings,
Right.
not about, being the biggest company in the S&P 500. They're about something much more grandiose. Because
Right.
that's what, draws you up and it helps you achieve more than what you otherwise would.
I think what one of the great challenges I see in companies I speak to that are dealing with all of these issues around culture is sometimes you say all the right things,
Yes.
and then you say, by the way, we want to care for every person that's on the other end of the phone line, but by the way, I want you to make 18 phone calls this hour, right? And
Yeah,
so what we measure and what we say we care about
totally.
are two very totally different things.
Well, there's a few things that I think are really important. I think the first thing um, that I think a leader should embrace is the idea that you should be the hardest working person on the team. Just because you might be more senior or you might have more experience or something along those lines, that doesn't open up the opportunity to coast. You need to carry the burden of the team. And I had to live this in a way that I really didn't want to. We were launching mutual funds at Morningstar, and one of our funds was alternatives, which meant you had to be registered in a special way with the Futures Association. And I had to take the Series 3 test. And actually, anyone could take it. And I could have given it to my team. And I think people on my team were kind of gearing themselves up to have to take this test. But I just didn't feel like it was right. I was the one who was insisting that we have this designation or to register in this fashion. So I ended up taking the test, and I was 6 months pregnant with our third child. I was falling asleep in the library trying to study for this stupid test. But I really felt like I had to lift that up. And I think the sense that if you guys are working together, if you're also carrying, the weight, and more so than the rest of the team, I think that's a sense of inspiration for people. So I guess seniority not being an excuse to give work, but a reason to take on work is, I think, really important. And then I think another really important thing, and this is something that I do with my team here at Empower, and something that I really started to develop at Morningstar, is this idea that everyone has a voice. I'm a really strong believer that there's a lot to be gained from each person's perspective, that it's not a top-down thing, it's a bottom-up thing. And our insights and our research benefits from someone else taking a look at it. So one of the things I do is I always ask, the most junior person in the room for his or her perspective before going on to more senior people, so that that person has a chance to give a voice before someone senior starts influencing what the take is. Giving people important assignments. If we're presenting, the analyst is presenting some of those slides too. It's not just me. That experience was really hugely helpful. People did that for me as I developed my career. And I think the sense that you own it, that you're part of the team, you're part of the output, your name goes on it as well. I think that's hugely important.
Wow, I love that concept of looking for the most junior person in the room and getting their input before letting other people maybe change what input they might have offered. Right.
Right.
Because often if the loudest, most experienced voice starts speaking, everybody else just kind of steps
Not their head.
Right. Yeah. That genius is the same genius I was thinking.
Yeah.
Before we continue, I want to remind you that if one of your 2025 goals is writing a book, but you don't know where to start, I'm here to help. In my new role as publisher at Forbes Books, I'm working alongside a world-class team to guide aspiring authors like you through the process of getting published. Whether it's a story, a big idea, or a project close to your heart, now's the time to make it happen. Just visit ForbesBooks.com/Don to get started. As an executive of an organization, right, today that serves 19 million individuals, crazy, 83,000 organizations, what leadership principles have you taken from sports? I know we've referred to a few of them already.
Yeah.
That you've applied into your business, other than grit, which we got. We got
grit big.
It's right. Can you maybe even share a story about how something that you learned in that space has impacted the way you lead today?
This is kind of interesting. I think grit is incredibly important. I also think strategic grit is incredibly important. I read a book a few years ago by Annie Duke. She's a professional poker player. and she's written a number of really good books. One of them is Quit. And it's this idea that sometimes you don't keep working at something. Sometimes it would be better for you to use your talent or skills in another way, or to give up on something. That return on it just isn't there. And I think that's something that it's not very American. We love the grit. We're grit people.
Right. You can't
but
quit. No
You
quitting.
can't quit. Quitting. I mean, quitting is like the worst thing for someone to do.
Right.
But sometimes it's actually the smartest and best thing because there's a higher and better purpose for what you're doing. And so I have always struggled with the idea of quitting. Obviously, I talked to you about how quitting soccer would still weighs on me.
It's right.
But I do think that there's something to be said for being really thoughtful about how you have a finite amount of time, a finite amount of energy, and being really thoughtful about how you apply it. So I talked a bit in the beginning about this idea that to combat burnout, we have to have the right mandate and the right purpose and the right focus. And I think to use our energy and our talents in the most effective way, we have to have clarity on how we're going to direct that energy and that talent. So when I came to Empower, my job at Empower is essentially to have an investment point of view, a market's point of view, and to offer that to financial media. And that capability wasn't established at Empower. So the first thing I did, rather than, calling all the people I knew in media and that kind of thing, was to say, who are we as investors? Who do we stand for? What do we want? How do we want to look at the world? So essentially have investment tenets that define how we're going to approach markets, what variables we're going to weigh, how we're going to come to conclusions. Having that sense of focus and that sense of purpose then can redirect our energy. And it can also say, hey, we're not going to cover this. So I have a small team. There's 3 of us working on investment insights, and then we're connecting with different people at Empower. There's stuff we can't cover. There's stuff that are super fascinating. I used to work on a global team. I love international markets. I love emerging markets. I don't have the capacity to cover those the way I used to. So having that sense of purpose and focus allows me to be much more strategic with my energy.
And so it allows you also, you're putting some guardrails around yourself, and allows you to kind of stay in a space that you can then become best in class at.
That's exactly right. It just allows a little bit of specialization that can yield good results.
Yeah, we had Condoleezza Rice on this podcast a while back, and one of the things she talked about was that when she's looking at any organization, but specifically she loves football, college football.
Yeah,
she goes, I want to put my energy and my belief behind an organization that has a defined, like, what you're going to get when you play Alabama, and you know what you're going to get, and that ability to actually have some more narrow definition of what, and if you're really good at it, it doesn't matter. They can't stop it.
To be realistic about it, there's a cost to it. I mean, if you're going to focus on this, you can't focus on that. And there could be opportunities that you miss because of it. Or if you're, a athletic organization, there could be teams that you don't match up well with.
Right.
Because you don't have, you focused on one thing and not another. So I think weighing the cost is important, and understanding that just because there is cost or a trade-off to it doesn't make it wrong.
Right. Does not mean you shouldn't go do that in that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You mentioned in an interview that I read that one of your mentors is Christine Benz, and that she played a pivotal role in your early career at Morningstar, helping you navigate both the company, right, which everybody needs a good mentor to do that occasionally, and to refine your skills. When you think about the advice she gave you as a mentor, we love the concept of mentorship. Was there something she said to you, or maybe a piece of advice that really had impact on you?
With Christine, and I'm still friends with Christine. She's still someone I go to lunch with and things. There were a few things I loved about her. One, just the way she carried herself was always, there was a real intellectual strength to her, but also a real approachability. So she was, a powerhouse in what she understood, but anyone could chat with her. But it was more what she did for me that was remarkable. I started at Morningstar. I was 26. I had worked in other industries. I didn't know a ton about investing. I was going through that for the CFA program, I had a lot of insecurity, a lot of imposter syndrome. I was, if not the youngest, I was close to the youngest on the team, one of the few females. I mean, just a lot of reasons to feel like, which of these objects doesn't belong type of exercise. And I would write a lot of analyses, and Christine was one of my editors. And instead of just kind of quickly going through it, she would write me page upon page of
Wow.
edits on how to improve my analysis. And then she, at the time, did a lot of media work and was on a lot of, CNBC and different shows. She had a standing Friday slot. And she started asking me to fill in for her. I'm 26. I've never done media. I have shown, I don't know why you'd think I'd be good at it, but she would always turn to me and have me fill in for her. And it was a huge endorsement from her that I was capable of doing more than I knew I was capable of doing. And I would imagine that some of the leadership principles I have around giving, newer, less experienced folks a voice stem partly from the example that she set for me. I don't even know how she wasn't like, I'm going to mentor Marta. It was much more who she was and how just what she naturally did for me.
But that's the beauty of true mentorship is that
Right.
it's not often declared, right? It's not a program.
That's right.
It's a mindset, right?
Yeah.
It's like I'm gonna find people to pour into, and in the process, I'm gonna get better too. I love that.
Right.
That's what real mentorship is.
Right.
Yeah.
It's actually similar to, we all know mentorship is a good thing. We know corporate values are a good thing, but to your point, they can either be noise or they can be real.
Right.
And for them to be organic, they have to be action. They can't just be words or a program or anything like that.
So one of the questions we ask a lot is because I've found over the years, having covered both sports and done a lot of work with business leaders, that I think one of the most overused words in corporate lexicon is the idea of teams, right? It's me and my team. The truth is, most teams in business aren't really teams. They're a bunch of people that have the same business card. But they're working for their individual goals to try to set themselves apart and maybe stand out. As someone who's been a part of teams, you've led teams. If you could help coach us a little bit about how do you take a group of individuals, mold them together in some way in which building a team is a real opportunity, a real possibility of success. What are some of the things you do to help take those individuals and pull them together?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're making a really astute point that there's a lot of emptiness to the idea of team, and that a lot of folks are playing like individuals on a field when ultimately they need to play like they're one cohesive unit. And to be a cohesive unit, that means that you're not a star all the time. And it's not about you. I think one of the things I would return to in creating a team is to be really clear on that mandate, that sense of purpose that you develop for a team of what we're trying to achieve. I think a second thing is to be really clear about the different roles that people are playing on a team, but not to make, and there are some roles that are senior and some roles that are junior, but that's a distinction between having subservient roles and kind of king of the hill roles. I think that is really a toxic way to run a team, where we might be a team, but there's a star and everyone else is supporting the star. I think that's incredibly toxic, no matter what the organization is. So I think the sense of value to each particular role. So if someone's an analyst, the value of the analyst, the power of that. One thing I've done over the course of my career to give people a sense that I'm sincere and saying, how impactful they are, is to make sure that I'm calling them out when I announce what we're doing. So, and being specific about it, not saying, hey, thanks, Joe, for the great work or whatever it is, but saying, thanks, Diana, for the thought that you put into this analysis that you created, outside of work, just being really specific. And those examples, it costs you nothing, maybe 3 minutes of thought, but it means a lot to other people. I created awards at my prior organization, and we had this voting mechanism, and it was peer nominated. And then I would send out like long spiels about the contributions of this person. And it meant a ton to people. So I think that sense of uh, understanding that everyone has a different role to play, but it's not a subservient thing, and their impact is ultimately what drives the outcome. I think that's super important.
That team of teammates concept, right? That idea that the most valuable people you might have in your organization might not ever get that fancy parking spot that
Right.
the employee of the month gets, or employee of the year gets, or whatever it is. Yeah.
It's just such the wrong focus too, to make it about the star. Not that there aren't incredible individuals, but ultimately the collective is so powerful, and you
Yep.
just don't want to lose that collective.
I love it. One of the questions the question I want to ask you here actually kind of reminds me. It's funny because one of our best conversations on this subject came from another executive named Kate Johnson at Lumen Technologies.
Mm.
I'm going to go ahead and make this little NFL comparison here. Lumen obviously has the Seahawks Stadium, Empower has the Broncos Stadium. So
Exactly.
our producer Savannah, huge Broncos fan, kind of made sure I had to say this. But one of the questions that we love to talk about is this concept of building momentum organizationally, right? Most of us who love sports can see momentum shifts. You almost can feel them, right? If you're
Yeah.
attentive enough. But I think it's true in business too, that there are times when something happens that gives you an outsized opportunity to progress. First question, and I'm gonna guess I know the answer listening to you for this
Mm.
last period. Do you believe that momentum is real? And then, if so, is there a moment where you've ever seen kind of momentum either in the marketplace as you've been watching it, or where you've seen kind of something turn for an organization that has given them kind of a running start that is almost unnatural?
Yeah. I wonder, I don't know. I wonder if I've seen it. I've seen it. I've lived it. I wonder if I can pinpoint the moment where the momentum really gathered. But here's how I'll think about it. That I think momentum is real, and I'm in finance. Momentum is a factor. You see it in markets all
Momentum
the time.
investing is
Momentum
like
investing is
right.
a real
Yeah.
thing.
Yep.
You can see it with ideas. You can see it. The internet really traffics in the momentum behind ideas. And sometimes, and I don't say this because I mentioned the internet, but sometimes momentum can lead you in the wrong direction, right? There's a
Absolutely. Right.
danger to momentum, right? Where the wrong idea or the wrong something gains 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 momentum.
Right.
But when it comes to organizations, I've worked. So now I'm at Empower. I spent a lot of my career at Morningstar, and I can kind of reflect on the momentum of both. What jumps out at me at the momentum at Morningstar was that what you had was a founder who had a vision of a company that could make investing more mainstream for individual investors, and he had a sense of philosophy. And what made momentum really work there is that that vision that he had transferred to the employees, and so he wouldn't be in the room; he would be somewhere else. But the vision was
Was
still
alive.
there, and you saw the business, carried on that momentum. And I think it's true with Empower too. Empower is a very different company. It's a very young company. And it has grown by acquisition and organically over time. And so it's early in its stages, but there's this sense now of we have the economies of scale, we have a vision, we have a future that is building in the here and now. And I think one thing that is important to remember about momentum is, as we think about, the grit and the grind of life, is that the momentum can be there, but the moments can still feel difficult. And I think I wouldn't want someone to think there's no momentum or there's no power to X, Y, and Z if I don't feel like I have that in any particular moment, because there can be a natural energy to something, but you still have to live second to second.
No, I totally agree. I think one of the things about momentum is that it is that thing people can't put their finger on it, you know. Uh,
Yes.
but it is, but if you can, but if there is that ability to think it through collectively as a group, there are opportunities, as you said, the vision of Morningstar and how it transcended whether the leader was in the room or not. Um,
Right.
it is it's a belief system, right?
It's a belief
Some
system.
Yeah, and I think it's if you can get people to believe, it's amazing what can happen.
Yeah, the book, The Tipping Point, comes to mind,
Yep.
where you see something all of a sudden switch over to mainstream. And I think there's a lot of truth in this idea that it is the collective belief system that makes it happen. 2016, if we're talking about sports, 2016 World Series, Cubs, the momentum shifts. That was a pretty powerful moment.
So I wrote a book. I wrote a book with David Ross, the Grandpa Rossi, the catcher of that team, who hit a home
Yep.
run in the seventh game of the World Series.
Wild.
Yeah,
Wild.
and so pretty cool. Marta, I can't thank you enough for giving us your time today and for being a corporate competitor today, sharing a little bit of the lessons that you've learned, how sports has helped make you the success story that you are, and I'm proud to have gotten a chance to spend this time with you.
Well, thank you so much. This was such a privilege. You're in the trenches day to day, and it's a real treat to step back and think about, some of the things that have made that happen. So thank you. I'm so thrilled. I'm going to have to, you mentioned the number of the different books you've written. I'm going to have to get on board and check some of those out because such powerful stories.
I know I don't want to go 400 meters with Marta, but boy, she took us something special today. I was riveted by the lessons she was offering. But by the way, one of the lessons for us is we're new to this YouTube space, live TV, right? Where your lights fall right in the middle of an interview. You just got to power on, right? As she said, got to bring grit to it and keep making it happen. But I want to give you 4 takeaways, 4 things that I took from this conversation that I think will make me better today. The first was her discussion about burnout and how real it is, and how it actually, the idea of what she had gone through before with burnout in her soccer career had impacted a decision she would later make at Morningstar. But she talked about, while she was going through this, making a pros and cons list, and that when she started to realize that if you have the right mandate and the right purpose, you can do more than you might actually think you're capable of, right? And I loved her quote, right? I'd rather have more exhaustion and less regret rather than more regret and less exhaustion. So that willingness to actually do something and actually make that work for her was the way that she dealt with burnout. But then she also kind of talked about this idea about grit, right? That sometimes we think of grit as the thing you have to have. It's the American way, no quitting. But at the end of the day, sometimes strategic grit, I never quite heard that phrase before. Strategic grit was a true discussion point. Is this worth it? Is there a better use of your energy, your time? And sometimes that might seem odd to have to make that choice, but she believes that that's an important thing to discuss. And then I loved, my third great takeaway was when she talked about running meetings, and then how she goes immediately to the most junior person in the room for an opinion of the situation. Doesn't let that opinion become infected or affected by all the senior folks who, if they speak first, might drown out the conversation. And then finally, my fourth great takeaway from this amazing conversation was her line about leaders should be the hardest working person on the team. Too many people rise to leadership and use it as a reason to start delegating and handing out everything to everybody else. But she talked about at Morningstar when she was, when there was a direction that they wanted to take, someone had to take this Series 3 test. And she could have delegated that to someone else on the team, but instead she chose to make it something she did herself. And in the result was that everybody understood how much it meant to her, and they suddenly became more invested. She talked about the idea that seniority is not an excuse to give work. It's actually a reason to take on work. And what an amazing series of lessons. I'm a bigger fan today than I was through the research process. But Marta is, in fact, one of the great corporate competitors we've had. I appreciate you for joining us today. I just got tape for the first time in my entire leadership of this team. They finally gave me tape. I don't think anybody ever trusted me with tape before.